Hi, thanks all for coming here and braving the elements. I suppose it's appropriate that this is a climate change meeting. It's my special privilege to welcome you all here this afternoon at the second public event of our new Global Energy Center. I'm Fred Kemp, President and CEO of the Atlantic Council. We've actually been doing energy work at the Atlantic Council for 20, 30 years before launching this center in something called the Energy and Environment Program. We relaunched it this year with a new label, the Global Energy Center, because we wanted to send a message that the Atlantic Council was going to do something fundamentally different, more ambitious, more global with this center. And certainly by hiring Dick Morningstar to be the director, with David Goldwyn taking on the chairman of the advisory council, with people like Carlos Pascual, Dan Poneman coming on the Atlantic Council board. I think it's pretty clear that the Atlantic Council is coming into this space in a much different, and I hope very useful way. We established this center at a time of unprecedented volatility and opportunity to work to promote global access to affordable, reliable, and sustainable energy. Global access to affordable, reliable, and sustainable energy. You'll hear that a lot from us. Alongside government, industry, and civil society partners, the center will devise creative responses to energy-related geopolitical conflicts, advance sustainable energy solutions, and identify trends to help develop energy strategies and policies that ensure long-term prosperity and security. So that's a very clear message about what we intend to do. Watching the pictures on the news this morning on one of the biggest blizzards in memory, the 5 U.S. states declaring states of emergency, braving the weather to come here today. We thank you very much for being here. 2015 will be a critical year for climate policy. In December, heads of state and government will meet in Paris to agree on a comprehensive and legally binding global framework to address the grave threat of climate change. Today's event is our first in a series of events on climate change gearing up for the Paris Summit. We're proud to have a great team headed by Ambassador Richard Morningstar, founding director of our Global Energy Center, working on these issues. We're also thrilled to welcome on board Heather Zichal, former Obama White House Deputy Assistant to the President for Energy and Climate Change, to guide our efforts on climate programming. So let me turn to Ambassador Morningstar to formally introduce Heather and to kick off the event.
Well, let me also welcome all of you here today, as Fred said, to the second program that we've had. I can tell you nothing, I don't think anything could be more important than our Road to Paris series that Heather is putting together and will be moderating. I want to emphasize, with respect to our new center, that we're going to have a very balanced program. We're going to look at geopolitical issues, some of which are more traditional geopolitical issues, but also we're going to look just as much at issues relating to governance, relating to sustainability, new technologies, looking at it in the context of the environment and alternative energy. And we are committed to really having this wide range, because if we don't look at all sides of all issues, then we'll have credibility on no issues. We also want to take the geopolitical issues, new technology issues, and so forth, and put it in a futuristic context. What kind of scenarios can we expect? We're not prophets. We're not going to be able to necessarily accurately predict the future, but we want to be able to think outside of the box and look at what various possibilities are. We do have at the center now something called a Strategic Foresight Initiative, and Strategic Foresight will be very much a part of what the Energy Center is doing. And I think this series is part of that. Take the U.S.-China agreement. Well, what does it mean? What effect might it have? What might happen in Paris as a result of that? And we have certainly experts here to talk about that today. Fred basically introduced Heather. You all know who she is. I can say the same words. We are very lucky to have her as a distinguished fellow here at the council. And I will say that this climate change series is the brainchild of Heather, as well as David Goldwyn, who's the chairman of our advisory board, who had a conflict today and unfortunately couldn't be here. So I know you're not here to listen to me anymore, so I'm going to turn it over to Heather, who will be the moderator, and will introduce our panel. So again, thank you for coming. A lot of people out in the audience, which is great, shows the interest in the subject, and hopefully in the Atlantic Council as well. By the way, introduce Cynthia Quarterman, who's here also as a distinguished fellow who will be setting up some programs too.
Great. Well, thank you for joining us this afternoon. We were joking before we got started and over lunch that I was sort of conflicted about what to call this panel. We could go with the traditional road to Paris. I was arguing for getting the band back together since I have so many former colleagues up here. But we're really excited to have them, three very distinguished individuals join us today. Rick Duke on the far end, Deputy Director for Energy and Climate Change at the White House. I had the pleasure of working with Rick for many years, and he was a great advocate and helped craft and is now working to implement the President's Climate Action Plan. We are also joined by Pete Ogden, Senior Fellow and Director of the International Energy and Climate Policy at the Center for American Progress. From 2012 to 2013, I was lucky enough to get to work with Pete at the White House when he worked on the National Security Staff as Director for Climate Change and Environmental Policy. Also did a stint at the State Department working with the Special Envoy for Climate Change, and has been a real advocate in the international climate space. And last, Dr. Andrew Steer is the President and CEO of the World Resources Institute, a global research organization that works in more than 50 countries. WRI's 450 experts work closely with leaders to address 6 urgent global challenges at the intersection of economic development and the natural environment, and obviously one of those is climate. So we're very, very lucky to have all of them here with us today. I think as we have all been paying attention to the president and action on the international climate front, it seems like almost not a month goes by where we're not hearing a new announcement coming out of the administration, and certainly have seen the president move and underscore his commitment to getting a deal in Paris, but also just more broadly the importance of climate change as he thinks about his second term and his legacy. So with that as the backdrop, we have a lot of really important questions and we want to dive right in. I'm going to start with you, Rick. Briefly, can you talk to us about what are the core elements of the U.S. plan and what has to happen for it to be implemented?
Great, thanks, Heather. And stepping back, I think when you look at the work that the president has put in motion on climate change, it's important to recall that a lot of important things happened even during the first term. So we had, during the first term, major policies put in place, like fuel economy standards that will double the efficiency of new vehicles by 2025, and also avoid 1 year's worth of emissions cumulatively over the life of that program. And we had lots of work on appliance standards. We doubled renewable energy, tremendous amount of progress made during the first term. And then in the second term, starting with the inaugural address, the president came out with a very strong statement on climate change and followed that quickly thereafter with the climate action plan that Heather already referenced. And let me just say a little bit about what's in the climate action plan and give a quick sense of some of the priorities within that and implementation underway now. The climate action plan from June of 2013 wove together 3 separate planks that all have important synergies. So it starts with cutting emissions of greenhouse gases or carbon pollution domestically. We also are working very hard, and the president has been leading to make sure that we leverage that domestic action in order to get global action on this global challenge. And then, of course, we're also working to prepare the nation for those impacts of climate change, which are already unavoidable, no matter how successful and how quickly we are able to cut emissions here and abroad. And to give a sense of what we're doing in terms of some of those dimensions, I'll focus in particular on the mitigation piece, on the emissions reduction domestically and internationally. We're also doing a tremendous amount with state and local leaders and modernizing federal programs and data, et cetera, to prepare the nation for climate impacts, but I'll leave that aside for now. Within the domestic program of the Climate Action Plan, building on those important policies from the first term, things like fuel economy standards and energy efficiency and renewables, we are also moving ahead with additional work that will improve energy productivity and that will clean the energy sources that we use. And that includes things like additional fuel economy standards for heavy-duty vehicles or trucks, which will help save money, improve energy security, and cut carbon pollution. It includes centrally the Environmental Protection Agency's Clean Power Plan, which will, per the proposal put out last June, involve important steady progress, building on work that states are already doing through things like renewable portfolio standards, important role for natural gas, energy efficiency programs, and making sure that all states are moving ahead to clean up their electricity supply and improve their energy efficiency apace. So that's an important piece of what we're doing domestically. We'll continue to do things like Department of Energy appliance efficiency standards. We've got 10 of those done last year. We've set a goal in the Climate Action Plan of having 3 billion metric tons of carbon pollution avoided by 2030 through appliance standards by the Department of Energy, and all that is moving ahead and on track. And in addition to that activity addressing the energy sector, which of course is the core of the challenge with emissions reduction, we're also working on non-CO2. So important work in progress addressing methane emissions in the oil and gas sector, and more broadly voluntary programs in the ag sector and other measures. And then lastly, just a word on hydrofluorocarbons. So these are rapidly growing emission source that's a very potent greenhouse gas. And that's a good example of how we're working both the domestic and the international at the same time and synergistically. So the Environmental Protection Agency has already taken some steps in partnership with industry to approve substitutes to hydrofluorocarbons that are less polluting and also work well for various air conditioning applications and the like. And then they're also moving forward with emissions reduction policies through something called the SNAP program. At the same time, the president has been leading to ensure that we are making progress towards an amendment to the Montreal Protocol that would allow us to achieve global scale progress on hydrofluorocarbons. And I want to emphasize the part about industry engagement. Last September, we brought together a whole suite of household name companies, and I'm not going to start listing them since I won't list enough of them if I do, for an event at the White House where serious pledges were made that would avoid 700 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent through private sector leadership by U.S. companies on alternatives to HFCs. And those same companies affirmed the work that we're doing towards an amendment on a Montreal Protocol amendment to get to global scale impact on that particular greenhouse gas. And in some sense, that interplay between domestic action and international diplomacy for HFCs in miniature is what we're doing on a larger scale with our domestic action as a way to build momentum towards success in the Paris context and more broadly on climate action. So we're very focused on that prize. And of course, the joint announcement with China made by the president of post-2020 emissions reduction targets from both countries is an important step, building momentum that is really quite palpable in international dialogues for other countries to step up, make serious post-2020 commitments, and deliver against them. So just briefly, well, maybe we'll come back to the U.S.-China later. Sorry, that went on longer than I expected. So.
That's quite all right. So moving to Andrew, I mean, we heard from Rick that, you know, we've got the U.S.-China deal, we've got the U.S. Deal in and of itself, new news about India. How do you assess the seriousness of these plans, and what impact do you think it will have on other countries?
Well, first of all, congratulations, Richard, and this wonderful organization for starting this program, and to you too, Heather. It's great to be here. Look, I think we're all more optimistic than we were 2 years ago about where we're going on climate change. The US-China deal was an extremely important move, as you say, not only because combined they account for almost 40% of emissions, and therefore in and of itself that matters, but because of the influence on others. I mean, if you add the European Union in, which also already has announced its offer of a 40% reduction from 1990 to 2030, you've now got half of all the world's emissions, US, China, and Europe, basically being announced already. So the question is that half of emissions doing what it needs to do in order to get onto a path for 2 degrees? And it's worth then thinking, well, what is the path to 2 degrees? And the way people think about this is to say, well, there is a least cost path. I mean, you could keep increasing emissions, you know, for a long time and then just cut them to zero. That would be a very bad idea because it would slow down or kill the world economy. So there is actually an optimal path to get to where we need to get to. So the question is, does this half, if you like, of the emissions from the United States, China, and Europe, does it get us onto that path where we need to be in 2025 or 2030? And the answer is, well, it goes quite a long way, but it doesn't do enough. I mean, it probably goes about 65% of where we need to go for that half. So then the question is, what about the other half? What about all the other countries? What's Brazil going to do? What's India going to do? What's Japan going to do? What's Australia going to do? And so on. And so that's all to play for right now. And there's no question but that the United States leadership in this area has been very important. I mean, the whole atmosphere in the Lima climate discussions in December in Peru, where probably several of you were there. Certainly, I know you two were there. I mean, it was a very different environment, and it was really great to be, for example, at the U.S. pavilion, for example, and the China pavilion. Right? Buzzy kind of places, interesting discussions, very different and more positive environment. So that's really good. Plain fact of that, and so just on the U.S. Target itself, I mean, this is quite ambitious to go from 17% reduction by 2020 to between 26 and 28% by 2025. I mean, that's a lot. That's a 10% reduction in the United States total greenhouse gas emissions at a time when hopefully the economy will also be probably 10% larger. I mean, this is actually quite impressive and difficult to do. So I don't think we can fault the United States for not doing more. Plain fact the matter is, though, because we sort of started somewhat later than we needed to, we still need to keep trying to do more. So the real issue is, as Rick was sort of implying, we need a package of policies that continues to deepen so that as we go through that 2025 period, if you like, the second derivative is really negative. In other words, we're accelerating our progress. The good news is that all of the analysis nowadays that the best economists in the world are doing are suggesting that actually the old-fashioned idea that it's going to cost you an awful lot to reduce your carbon emissions actually isn't true, that the smart way of doing it actually will promote more growth, more competitiveness, and so on. And moving on to the China story, that's exactly what China has figured out. I mean, China's commitment is to peak, as you know, by 2030, and you could say, well, that's not very impressive. Well, actually, it's quite impressive. Already, China had goals to reduce its carbon intensity of GDP by over 40% between 2005 and 2020. What they'll now need to do is invest in renewable energy an amount that is greater than their total amount of coal capacity right now by 2030, and they'll have to increase their renewable energy by an amount almost equivalent to the total United States electricity generation, all by 2030. So this is actually quite tough. And so, but the reason they're doing it is partly because they want to be part of the solution to climate change, but partly because the arithmetic and the economics suggests that it is in their interest to peak by 2030, even if climate change didn't exist. And this is a very important thing. We've done a great deal of work with Tsinghua University, a lot of modeling work, so is MIT, by the way. And this is part of what we call the new climate economy, which is part of what we set up a year ago, the Global Commission on the Economy and Climate, which President Felipe Calderon of Mexico chairs, and a whole bunch of distinguished ex-heads of state and finance ministers and CEOs of corporations are all on it. And you actually see that for several reasons, number one, reducing domestic pollution. Number two, increasing the efficiency of resource use. Number three, new technology that will be promoted. And number four, new approaches to urbanization. It turns out that doing those will get you to peak by 2030 in your own interest. And so China is now on a path which is very encouraging. It's now, as you know, it's experimenting with over 100 million people, a cap and trade on carbon emissions, which will go national, we expect in 2016 or 2017. Some pretty serious efforts out there, and already, as you know, they are investing more in solar and in wind than any other country on the planet. So the trajectory is good, but it's not enough.
Right. So one thing that I think would be helpful when we talk about China a great deal, we again reference India. How do all of these side deals actually lead into this and feed into this bigger process that we're going to be seeing in Paris at the end of the year? Pete?
Yep. Thanks, and thanks for having me to this discussion today. I think it's a great question. I think, as Andrew says, when you look at the commitments that China has put forth, the United States has put forth, and EU is already locked in, you actually have countries making commitments that do amount to half or more of total emissions. If you think of it through the question that Heather just asked, which is how do all these puzzle pieces fit together, the 194 puzzle pieces that have to fit together to get an agreement, I don't think you could say at this point that the China piece, the EU piece, the United States piece, even those three pieces have actually been snapped together yet. And I think that there's been a lot of work to do that, but there's still, a distance to travel. And one of the features of the treaty, the UN, the convention, the UN Framework Convention, under which all of these negotiations happen, is that it operates by consensus. So you can't get there. There's no puzzle complete until every piece is in place. And it really does, in truth, the negotiations, truthfully, are not a process. And you know this extremely well, but it's not as if you have a situation in which the 196 countries around the world happily delegate to 10 countries to come up with an agreement. I mean, far from it. There's a little bit of that maybe on the margins, but for the most part, every country is very involved and very willing to stand up for its own interests. And so, not to cause you to panic and run out of here right now, but but this will be reassuring, which is that, if you think back to where we were on January 26, 2009, a year before Copenhagen, we were 6 days into the president's first term in office. We had, you can imagine, that was 11 months away to the Copenhagen conference, which was kind of at the time, was meant to be what the Paris Agreement is supposed to be, which is the final sort of architecture for an international agreement on climate policy. And Heather knows this better than anybody. At that point, the administration launched into a negotiation without the benefit of 6 years of domestic climate action. We had hopes for a cap and trade bill, on which really our whole policy hinged internationally. And not only that, but we hadn't done any of the diplomatic groundwork. There was no way that we were going to announce anything like what was just announced in November with China in the span of a few weeks of a new administration. That was something that was built to and was been worked towards over 6 years. And so, I think when you look at it through that lens, the fact that we have a year from now until there, you have countries like China in a fundamentally different position than they were in the negotiating space. You have countries like India who I think you see also moving towards a fundamentally different position. I don't think at this point anyone would say what happened during President Obama's trip to India was kind of the moral equivalent of what happened with China. Right. But I think in terms of a country that stands not just for itself in the context of the negotiations, but tends to also be to represent kind of a swath of developing countries, and to see itself as looking out for the rights of a whole group of affected countries. To see a prime minister, as Prime Minister Modi did, sort of establish a kind of personal stake in the outcome was very different from anything we've seen with them before. One of the kind of political agreements in the meeting was that Prime Minister Modi and President Obama would maintain a kind of leader level contact, kind of like a hot, red phone for the climate talks over the next year. And to even have that, this is a negotiation where a lot of developing countries have a lot of skepticism about whether the developed countries are going to act in good faith and so on and so forth. And just to know that India is kind of invested in an outcome, I think was pretty serious. So which is just to say, there's a lot of pieces, and we can talk more about how you actually stitch together and what the elements of a package look like that can get 194 countries. I keep guessing at how many total countries there are in the world, but if anyone knows exactly. But I think that there's the groundwork is much stronger than it was 6 years ago.
Well, I think that's a good segue to talk about, you lay out a very daunting case, but also highlight the fact that there are some opportunities. And I think as people think about Paris, there's sort of two key questions come to mind. First is, how do you define success? And second, you've got all these countries that make these commitments. How do you ensure that they're binding? Mm-hmm. And I think those are certainly the two questions I have as we think about the road to Paris. And I think on that front, Andrew, I'd love to hear from you about how do you define success, and what do you look for by way of enforcement? Mm.
Well, in the old days, before Copenhagen, we had this sort of notion there was going to be a textbook sort of climate deal where we would estimate how much greenhouse gases were allowed to go up there, and then we'd say, okay, how are we going to allocate them? This country can do this country can do that, and then you have to then limit it, and if you don't, you get sent to prison kind of thing, as sort of a global treaty that everybody is accountable to. Well, forget it. That's not what's going to happen. And in many ways, the United States for a long time has been pushing a sort of something which I think the United States would say is more genuine, sort of more of a bottom-up. It used to be called pledge and review, and that's where we're coming out. The offers you make are called INDCs. You see, that's it. Intended nationally determined contribution. So no one will talk about, oh, what's your pledge? They'll say, what's your INDC? Which normal human beings have no idea what it's about. But the ND is nationally determined, which means you can choose what you offer. So, so what is looked for? There are 4 things we need out of the Paris deal. 1, INDCs that are reasonably decent to get to the right place. In other words, to get onto that optimal path I was talking about. Realistically, if the rate of effort is 65% of what's needed, that will be reasonable. Now, what that means is a very technical thing, but obviously we've got to push as hard as possible to get as close to that optimal path as possible. And half the countries will probably pledge up until 2025, and some will then pledge to 2030. And it's not clear whether or not we'll allow that kind of differentiation. Number 2, you need then a review process with an agreement that you'll come back at least every 5 years, and you will have a serious sort of notion of accountability and ratcheting up. No one's going to get sent to prison. There's not going to be any, sanctions against countries, I doubt. So that's the second thing. Third thing, because we actually won't be on that optimal path, you need some notion of where you're going over the long term, what we call a long-term anchor. And now this is going to be difficult to get, but basically you need something like by 2060 or 2070, the world will go to net carbon neutrality or net greenhouse gas neutrality or something. Interestingly, last week in Davos, a group of business leaders announced that they believe the target should be it should be net greenhouse gas neutrality by 2050, which is very ambitious, by the way, which illustrates, by the way, how the private sector is now really starting to get it, even though this is a small group. And the 4th thing you need is a sort of notion of a financing mechanism that actually will support countries that will need support. And here the United States deserves a great deal of credit for its $3 billion pledge to the Green Climate Fund. Now, so that's sort of what you're looking for, but you need more than that because you still won't be on that optimal path. And so in addition to that, the French government, who's going to be the presidency of the Paris meeting, obviously, they're thinking about, right, in addition to this, which is the formal legal stuff, you're going to probably have some very important announcements of specific initiatives, which won't be embedded in legal documents, but can help raise the tone. So, for example, on carbon pricing, we now have 70 countries and 1,000 corporations that have signed up to the World Bank. The World Bank has been a sort of ringleader in this and done a really good job, signed up to the notion there should be a carbon price. By Paris, who knows? Maybe we'll get an actual price that they agree to. That would be amazing. There are several other such initiatives. For example, restoration of landscapes. There are 2 billion hectares in the world that used to be forests, but now are just degraded. They don't really achieve anything. Very low quality agriculture. If you restored that to good quality agriculture or to forests, you could close the carbon gap and earn a very attractive rate of economic return. You could close the carbon gap by up to 20%. That's another example. And so on. For example, the Compact of Mayors. The really exciting action in many countries is happening at the subnational level. And by the way, the United States is also a great leader in this, obviously. And in September in New York, 280 mayors of major cities committed to what they called a Compact of Mayors, which said, we believe that low carbon development will be good for our citizens, it'll make us more competitive, it'll make us more compact, it'll move towards public transportation, which is more efficient, it will cut back the fact that we lose 10% of our city GDP in congestion, and another 10% in pollution, and another 5% in traffic accidents, and we want to cut that loss, and that cutting will actually make us more competitive, and by the way, it also will get us onto a trajectory for carbon that will be much, much lower and will peak very, very soon. So these are examples of special initiatives that we're all going to be working on very, very hard in the coming months. And last week in Davos was a very, very central part of Davos, was getting the private sector together with governments who are part of, if you like, the coalition of the willing to move forward. So you need the legal thing in Paris, but then you need the idea of sort of special initiatives which will raise the overall level of ambition.
Mm-hmm. So Andrew laid out 4 indicators of success, and as you listen to it, I mean, all I can think of is why would anybody possibly commit to this? And in a world where you don't have the international jail anymore, how do you ensure enforcement? And how does that conversation happen? Pete, do you have some thoughts here?
Well, I mean, I don't think you ensure enforcement quite. I mean, I think what you can do is try to guarantee the most transparency possible into the process and into countries' ability to hit those targets. I mean, this was a big piece of the question in the Copenhagen Agreement back in 2009. The way to get, you could either, there was sort of a stark choice. You can stick with a Kyoto Protocol model, a treaty model that applied to a small number of countries, developed countries, or you expanded it to all the major emerging economies, plus other countries, all the major economies, both developed and emerging, allow them to put in their own contributions, their own self-determined targets, and then report out on how they're doing towards those. And, I think if you look back, I mean, there's different schools of thought. On the one hand, there are people who believe and who would still say the most important thing is that we get this locked into a treaty. A treaty is the only way to ensure maximum compliance. Mm-hmm. And other people would say, well, the challenges with a treaty is maybe twofold. One is first of all, does it encourage you to be as ambitious in your target setting or less ambitious in your target setting if you're facing some sort of punitive result for failure to hit your target? So do you risk kind of undercommitment, right? And then second order is how much more really, nothing, even a treaty is not the same as some kind of, penal enforcement, right? I mean, at the end of the day, you saw out of the Kyoto Protocol, countries, when they no longer thought they could hit their targets, they dropped out. You can always reverse course. And, again, whether or not there are certain, people might say that there's a higher bar to sort of exit. But, the Copenhagen experience has been pretty positive. I mean, most of the countries are doing what they said they would do and are on target. I mean, and I think in the United States we had this experience where we set the reason that the United States, how did we come up with a 17% by 2020 reduction target? That was derived from cap-and-trade legislation that had passed the House of Representatives. So it was going to be a beautiful marrying up of international targets with domestic law. Then the bill stalled and then collapsed a year later. And the question was, what do you do? And and no one had an immediate answer. The president said there's more to one way to skin the cat. Then everyone had to figure out what that other way was. and people over the subsequent years built up a series of policies, and until the last major piece was put into place, the Clean Power Plan that Rick mentioned, and when that was being decided and when that was being determined, they did it with full awareness that a more stringent plan would allow them to hit the 17% target that they had committed to globally before. A weaker plan that falls short of it. And they ended up with a plan that can get us there. Mm-hmm. So, I think to countries around the world who, China included, where I think that they were very, I think they're sometimes a bit flummoxed by the fact that we can't, that unexpected political developments can happen in a country. And, I think they had been counting on, cap and trade, and they said afterwards, well, what are you going to do? How could you let this happen? Well, it's not, it's not quite that simple. We didn't want this to happen, but it was out of the power of the administration to make happen with our form of government. And yet, I think they've since had, they've seen the administration pick up the pieces and find another path forward. So I think people look to that, again, with the experience of Copenhagen, it's given people more confidence that, in fact, non-international legally binding targets can have material impact on countries' domestic planning.
Right. So Rick, before we leave Paris, perhaps you can give us some sense of what happens after Paris. Does it change our diplomacy? What is our posture after the negotiations wrap up?
Well, so while it's not yet it's not still a full year to Paris, unfortunately, because every day counts and we're busy. It is almost a year, and so it's early days to say exactly what Paris will yield. We have a sense of the broad contours. I think we have a lot of momentum with the U.S.-China joint announcement of our post-20 targets, the EU stepping up, and strong commitment from Prime Minister Modi just in the last couple of days, and other signs of momentum. And so we're very encouraged about the momentum towards a successful outcome there. And we have a rough sense of the shape of the elephant, but we don't know exactly what will come out of Paris yet. In a positive scenario where it coalesces into a full agreement, then I think what comes next is principally implementation. So just as we're implementing domestically the Climate Action Plan and hitting our numbers accordingly, we would be seeing other countries move ahead to implement their nationally determined contributions, which would at that point be nationally determined contributions, no longer intended, but actual nationally determined contributions. And I think we would do everything that we can to work bilaterally and multilaterally with other governments on those policy priorities to get their own emissions reductions in motion. And so lots to build on in that domain. And let me just mention a couple of things. In the energy space, the Department of Energy has been running the Clean Energy Ministerial, which involves all the major economies on practical policy cooperation in areas like appliance efficiency. We've seen, for example, India step up and put in place world-leading appliance standards as part of that technical cooperation and effort. And we see just this week good signs that India is interested in working with us on fuel economy standards as part of the president's trip to India. So both multilaterally and bilaterally, lots of opportunity to advance the policies that are needed in other countries for them to hit their soon-to-be announced or already announced emission reduction goals. And so I think that we'll hopefully be in that implementation mode and doing everything we can to help others. In the event that things don't fully coalesce, we'll obviously have to take stock of where we are and set the best course we can thereafter. I think it's notable that in the context of Copenhagen, there was some work still to be done the following year in Cancun, and that actually succeeded quite well as a 1-2 punch.
Okay, that's helpful. So switching gears for a minute, I think there's been a lot of debate about the equity of climate commitments, and sort of what are we asking less developed countries to do, and what's the cost of those adjustments? I know Andrew, WRI, has done a lot of work on the path to lower emissions in different parts of the world. Can you talk a bit about the kind of transformation major countries in Latin America or Africa might have to go through?
Well, we've just done this major piece of work called the New Climate Economy, which is a sort of worldwide. We coordinate it with a lead partner, but actually it's done by research institutes around the world. And we asked essentially two questions. How much will it cost to move from today's high carbon, low efficiency world to tomorrow's low carbon, high efficiency world? How much will it cost? And what will it do to your growth, your economic growth? Well, and so we did very, very detailed calculations looking at the next 15 years, 2015 to 2030, across three major spheres of the economy. That is energy, rural development, forests, agriculture, and so on, and then cities. And basically $90 trillion will be invested regardless over the next 15 years, whether you do it well or badly. And then we look to the extent to which, how much will it cost more to do it right? And of that 90 trillion, it's about 6 trillion more for energy efficiency. It's about 3 trillion more to do the renewable energy. but then actually you start saving by the fact you actually don't need so many power plants, you don't need so many transmission lines. You design your cities differently, and you can save $3 trillion if you start designing your cities differently. At the moment, cities in the emerging world are spreading out like this because they raise their money through selling land, for example. That's how they finance their city expansion. But they've just discovered in China they're spending more than they're raising by building superhighways out to the suburbs, by building transmission lines out to the suburbs, by building sanitation and water and all that kind of thing. So they're now, for the first time in 30 years, Beijing is starting to re-intensify. That worldwide, if you'd started to do that, you'd save $3 trillion. And then so it turns out your investment would have been 90 trillion. Turns out it's about 91 or 92 trillion. But then you save another 4 trillion by the fact you don't have to pay for coal anymore, because once you've built your solar plant, you don't have any really serious, so you save all that recurrent cost. So it turns out, and this was a group, by the way, not of environmentalists, we put together a team of economists that were the best growth economists in the world, 2 Nobel Prize winners, and then a whole group of non-environmental growth specialists. So this is their analysis, and they came out with this. So number one, it doesn't cost more if you do it right. But then the question is, what does it do to your growth? Nice that it doesn't cost more, but are you going to grow slower because of this? Well, it turns out that doing the right thing on climate change actually it promotes efficiencies that we should have been doing all the time. So energy efficiency, for example, we know we should be doing it, but we're not doing it for reasons that we now understand. We're called behavioral economics. Second, the technological advances that come. China is understanding that very well. Third, the infrastructure gap in the world is currently $1 trillion a year, but because you actually spend less now on infrastructure in cities, if you do it right, you actually save that, and therefore you close the infrastructure gap. So and the fourth reason is that it turns out that at the moment, investment in the world is lower than we thought. Lower than it could be because nobody knows whether there's going to be a price on carbon or not. So it turns out there's a lot of delayed investment right now. If you have confidence as to what the price of carbon will be, investment will rise. So these economists did all that analysis to show that actually you don't need to pay a price in economic growth. So that's the good news. I mean, the challenging news is that most politicians don't understand this yet. So there's that. And two, it does require leadership, because not everybody's a winner. Even though the economy as a whole is a winner, even though the poor are almost certainly winners, and even although on average people are better off, there are winners and losers. So it requires really smart politics to, if you like, arbitrate between the winners and losers to make sure that even although there are many, many more people that have jobs in renewables than in the coal industry, you still do need to deal with the issue of the coal industry, and that is a very tough issue to deal with.
Right. So Pete, you have obviously at CAP read a number of studies, been part of developing studies about the economic opportunity, and sort of listening to the conclusion in WRI's report, not dissimilar to many of the findings that you and I read when we were working in the government. And then at the same time, you've also been part of these conversations and part of these international negotiations. I mean, if you're an LDC and you hear this, like, don't worry, you'll see 1,000 flowers bloom, like, how does that, and I think Andrew's being very clear about the need to navigate the politics between the winners and the losers, and I'm not simplifying things, but is there an openness to hearing that conversation? What's your sense?
I think there's always a division between the negotiators and who are negotiators. They're there to get the best terms and to to push hard for to get what they can out of the process. And then what the kind of the real economy is and what's actually happening, and and you hope that ultimately they can be complementary with the negotiations kind of providing some kind of directional sense of where countries' policymaker priorities are. Mm-hmm. That then you hope, then that will actually send signals to investors and to the broader community, so that those two can kind of work together. I think it's one of the most to me, one of the most meaningful parts of the U.S.-China announcement is not just sort of the identification of kind of big targets, but it was the other point that Andrew made, the notion they were going to try to get 20% of their entire fuel mix from clean energy, which, and as Andrew also noted, that's the equivalent of virtually the entire electrical capacity of the United States. Now, that's a situation where if I'm in the clean tech business, you think, okay, that makes sense, there's something. You know, they've said they're going to do this. What does that mean? I mean, that means now I've been given a signal that there's going to be a big push in this space. What is it going to look like? How are they going to grow? And if I'm inside the government there, I'm thinking, okay, it makes sense to me. I'm going to get these signals. This is a priority. If I'm working in their National Energy Administration, like this is something that we need to try to account for. We don't want to be looking like we're failing on our commitment. So those kinds of targets can have a kind of material impact, I think, in terms of how they're going about it. And many of these countries again also have very ambitious national priorities. I mean, India's has this an enormous solar target for itself, very aggressive, wind target for itself, very aggressive. So I think that there's a recognition that that they want to achieve these goals. They see the benefits. They see the economic, health, energy security benefits. As Andrew said, sometimes it's not even the climate benefit that's the most appealing one. But they don't. But always. But I think the role for the international community is figuring out, okay, how do we, help them to achieve the goals that they've set for themselves that are in the U.S. interest and in the global interest.
Right.
I mean, I think, one of the areas where we've seen a lot of thinking on this is around fossil fuel subsidies, and this is something that Andrew's report also identified. It's an area of broadly recognized. You go to treasuries, across the world, they lament the inefficiencies of public subsidy. There's until this year they'll be lower because of the drop price of oil, but until this year, last year was $500 billion of public money was spent subsidizing fossil fuels globally. And in very few cases was it done in a targeted way. Most of a very small percentage of it, 10, 12%, is actually captured by the bottom poorest 20% of a given population, because generally it's passed through in terms of just artificially low gas prices. If you're filling up your motorbike once a month, you cap a little bit of financial benefit. If you're filling up a fleet of SUVs once a week, you're getting a lot of subsidy out of that, even if you don't really need it. And I think it's one of those political problems that I think countries recognize, want to reform. Mm-hmm. They realize that it's an expenditure in something that they'd rather invest that in something else, in health or infrastructure or whatever it might be. Or certainly to make it more targeted in its application, and so it's a case where the recognition of what is in their economic self-interest is there, but there needs to be work done to bridge that and make it a reality. And right. Speaking of fossil fuel subsidies, I think hopefully is actually very encouraging that with the fall in the price of oil, you've seen a lot of countries take the opportunity to delink to let their oil prices float. And you've seen that in India, decoupling of oil prices, and in Indonesia as well, and Malaysia. It'll be a challenge once those prices start to go up again to maintain that. But you can see people sort of zeroing in on the moment of opportunity here. And I think that's a really important thing, and something that we should be really supportive of.
And one really quick last question for you, Rick. I mean, Pete obviously paid reference to the declining price of crude. Mm-hmm. How is that impacting the thinking internally of the broader climate agenda, if at all?
Well, I think we live in a dynamic global economy, and so things are constantly shifting, and some things are broadly helpful in terms of carbon pollution reduction. Of course, the tremendous progress that has been made in developing low-cost natural gas in this country has been a helpful part of what's happened in recent years. The volatility in oil prices we expect to continue. I think the President has been very clear recently that Americans shouldn't expect that this will be a permanent condition, and when they're making choices at the auto dealer, they ought to bear that in mind and not run out and get a gas guzzler. I think to Pete's point, and I'm really glad you raised that, I was going to if you didn't, the U.S. government has been deeply engaged in the G20 context in this fossil fuel subsidy phase-out effort, Pete himself when he was at NSC. And I think this really is a year of opportunity on that front as well. We are hoping to work with other governments to keep building momentum on that front. IEA and others have done analyses that show that if you can delete those inefficient subsidies worldwide, has a huge benefit in terms of carbon pollution reduction and economic growth and being able to deal with fiscal crises and invest in things that matter in places like Indonesia and India that have already gone down that track, taking advantage of the lower oil price environment. I think that there are other aspects domestically that low oil prices bring, but one thing that is clear is that it's going to add momentum to the already strong economic growth that we're seeing, and that's always helpful when you're doing environmental policy, as you know better than anyone.
Great. Well, thank you. I know our panelists have been incredibly generous with their time, but we also have a great crowd here that I suspect might have a question or two, so we'd love to open it up to the audience, and I'll just call on folks. Yes. In the, yep, you. Oh, sorry.
And also, please identify yourself and stand up when you ask the question.
Brian Beery, Washington correspondent for Europolitics. I think my question is more for Mr. Duke, and it's about the summit itself. There's a school of thought, I was talking to my colleague in Brussels about whether all the leaders should actually go to the summit, because when it happened in Copenhagen, it didn't seem to help very much. What's the latest thinking in the White House about this?
Thank you for the question. It is not 12 months out, but it is still a long time off from Paris, and so I really can't comment on exactly what the hosts are considering on that front. I think that I will just say generically that the level of negotiations does matter, and so and there are frankly pros and cons in terms of that. I think we are very focused on getting the substance right and having Todd Stern able to lead things to successful closure.
Great. Coming back.
Hi, I'm Paul Bledsoe with the German Marshall Fund. Thanks for holding this great event. Wanted to ask about sort of the political and messaging expectations ahead of Paris. Andrew mentioned that 65% of 2 degrees C would be a great outcome, which I completely agree with. What other venues do you all see emphasizing other than the UN process to meet long-term climate goals? In particular, Montreal Protocol, G20, development banks, and especially black carbon. I'd be interested in your thoughts.
Pete?
I mean, I think, one of the, well, you can talk about what the administration's priorities are now, but I mean, I think there's been a recognition that the UN process, which has been really consumed by coming up with the architecture for an agreement, not with kind of driving, it hasn't been a forum that's devoted its time and energies primarily to building partnerships and trying to sort of get in the weeds of solving the problems along the way you were talking about. I mean, it's been trying to negotiate an enormous architecture of a new agreement. And one of the, I think on the one hand, I think that the Copenhagen Agreement had many strengths. One of them was not its durability. And so the challenge with Copenhagen was it was a huge amount of effort that went into it, but it came with a very short sunset clause. So it was launched, and we came to an agreement, but it was done in 2020, and so immediately the wheels started turning to the next agreement, and so you have to do you have to start that entire process and refight for every sort of inch of progress in many ways. So as a result of the kind of the time and effort required to build that up, and I think that one of the features has been talked about, one of the important ways to measure success in Paris is that it gets us out of that it's a durable agreement, so that it can then become more involved with trying to having set up the architecture to solving the problems that it's defined and achieving the goals it's defined for itself. But as a result of that, there's been a kind of active attempt to find other venues for process. So some of them are totally new, or were new to this administration. The Climate and Clean Air Coalition, for instance, which focuses on things like methane, black carbon.
Right.
You've also seen a lot of focus in the G20, for instance, to try to use that, not just as a forum for pushing forward on fossil fuel subsidy phase out, but also progress on areas like vehicle efficiency. And I would think that will be kind of a big opportunity this year on the fossil subsidy side. You also have you have an increasing focus. I mean, Andrew is one of the leaders in terms of when he was at the World Bank in terms of helping them to integrate climate policy into the broader operations of the international financial institutions. I think they're trying to take that forward. I'd love to hear your perspective on that. I think they play a critical role because of the enormous amount of contact they have across the full economies of many of these developing countries to be figuring out how best to help with processes like subsidy phase out and reforms they're sort of already involved in, but not thinking of everything in terms of its full climate implications. And then I think you'll continue to see diplomatic. I think you'll continue to see the president use all of his bilateral engagement on this. I mean, I think it was one of the question before was about whether the president would go again to Paris. I mean, I don't think that the problem was that the leaders arrived. I think the leaders arrived in Copenhagen and thankfully got the deal done. I think ideally, hopefully this time, if they arrive, it'll be much more ceremonial.
And warmer.
Can I just add one more? You specifically referenced black carbon,
sorry.
and I was just going to mention something that's already in motion that is a fantastic initiative led by the Department of Energy with great partnership from government of Italy and a bunch of others. The Global Lighting and Energy Access Partnership is moving ahead to build the momentum that's happening commercially for off-grid houses to move away from fuel-based lighting, which is an incredibly dirty and unhealthy and black carbon-producing way to light your off-grid home in developing countries. So kerosene-based lighting is ubiquitous, but now increasingly ubiquitous are quality-assured, low-cost solar LED lanterns and devices that this Global LEAP initiative is helping to make happen. And even just this week with the announcement between Prime Minister Modi and President Obama, you see important attention there to super efficient off-grid appliances, so very high-efficiency televisions and devices like this that can help address a remarkably important source of black carbon, which is one of the emerging greenhouse gases that we need to grapple with. The science on that, of course, is still evolving rapidly, but it's clear that black carbon matters, and we're factoring it into our thinking and initiatives like this.
Great.
Sherry Goodman, CNA and Atlantic Council Board Director. Heather, thank you very much for organizing this. Thank you. Ambassador Morningstar for being here at the Atlantic Council, and thank you to a great panel. It's great to have you here. Can you share with us your best case and worst case scenario for how Congress is going to react to the administration's plans on the road to Paris?
Andrew, you drew the short straw.
Well, the best case scenario is that that the work of some of the best economists in the world would become known and would be welcomed.
About the new Congress.
Yes. Yeah, but the new Congress actually is committed to America's future, to America's economy, to America's role in the world, to America's competitiveness, to jobs. To a small government, by the way. Don't need a bigger government because you believe in climate change. Actually, it turns out that we're taxing things that are really good, like work and profits. Why are we doing that when we aren't taxing things that are bad, like pollution and congestion? And ever since 1923, when the great Professor Pigou at Cambridge University taught us about, pricing externalities, we've known that this is balmy. I mean, we're just doing ridiculous things. And of all people, obviously, those of us that are conservative economically should understand that because it adds efficiency to the economy. So the best outlook is that there would be a recognition of what economists are now telling us. The worst outcome would be as if there just is no support for what the United States is trying to do in the world with regard to climate change. So, for example, the great work that you three here have done, by the way, and we should have said at the beginning, I mean, Heather, you're looking so much more relaxed than you did in May 2013, just before the president's announcement. But for example, I mean, suppose we didn't get, good regulations this summer on existing power plants. I mean, suppose they were weakened one way or the other. I mean, this would be really bad for America's competitiveness. It'd be really bad for America's future, but it would also be really bad for the image given in the world, and we'd be on a bad path. Now, luckily, this is very much in the president's decision. Under his existing authority, he can move ahead. But for example, the $3 billion that the United States government has committed to the Green Climate Fund, if for some reason that were not appropriated adequately, I mean, this would be bad. So, but I'm very optimistic about the good news possibility.
Ditto.
I think we have time for one more question from the audience. Do we have? Yes.
Sarah Hunt with the Niskanen Center. Mr. Steer, you suggested that we might be approaching international agreement on a price for carbon. And what do you think this means for the possibility of a carbon tax as a mechanism for implementation or enforcement?
Well, when international agreement, I don't see any legal agreement on a price on carbon. I mean, I think in the old days leading up to Copenhagen, maybe we did think that there would be embedded in the legal agreement, there'd be a worldwide trading system for carbon. I think that's not going to happen now. Look, I think some countries will choose the tax and the cap and trade approach, and then they will start trading with each other. When Europe starts trading with China and with California and with the other, they're then going to get an emerging price on carbon. But I think increasingly countries also will want to put a tax on carbon as they lower the tax on other things. I don't think there'll be a worldwide agreement on that. It's very encouraging that 70 countries have now said they really believe in it. There now are 36 countries that have a price on carbon, which is, it's catching on. Now, sadly, some countries like Australia last year took theirs off. But I think we are encouraged. And back to the question about what are the other fora, I do think the G20, the Turkish G20 coming along, I think, as both of you were saying, I think the issue of energy subsidies, I think we may see a breakthrough on that. I really do. And then obviously once you've gone through the energy subsidy removal, you can then actually think of a positive price.
Great. Well, on that note, I want to first start by thanking our panelists who've been terrific and very generous with your time. I think we all learned a lot from your perspectives. And I think we're all going to be able to leave this conversation recognizing that there's good reasons to be hopeful about our prospects in Paris. And this is the first in a series of three-part dialogue about the road to Paris. So I want to thank the Atlantic Council and the Ambassador Cezanne and the team here at the Atlantic Council for hosting us today.
Thank you, Heather. And before thanking Heather and the panel, a couple of announcements. First of all, I'm glad that Sherry introduced herself as a board member. I meant to do that. Are there any other board members around? See, you're the representative. And I do want to make a couple of announcements on future programs. Next Tuesday, February 3rd, February 3rd, from 1:30 to 2:30, hopefully you'll be getting a notice, we're having the EU Energy Commissioner Miguel Arias Cañete here. He'll be speaking for an hour. It'll be more, I think, a conversational type event again, and I'm sure he'll be talking about the proposed European Energy Union, how feasible that is in light of all of the EU issues that we've seen over the now and in the past, for quite a while. In any event, I think that'll be a fascinating program. We expect to have the second in our climate change series the third week in February. You'll be getting a notice on that there. There's not a definite date on that at this point. And there will be many other programs coming along. We believe we're going to be having a new technology series starting in April. We'll be having a task force and meetings on global energy security based on oil prices and so on. So we're going to be very active. So on that note, I'd like to thank Heather and the panel for a great program, and I hope you'll all give them a round of applause.
Thank you.